Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for March 19th, 2013. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. I'm joined today with John Markley, Stan Nurilov, and John Hogoboom. Thanks, guys, for joining us. I'm Brian Rexroad. And I guess what we'll do is pass it over to John Markley here first. And John, I guess we have yet another incident of malware in mobile devices. This one sounds a little interesting. What can you tell us?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting story. There is a piece of malware that advertises itself kind of as a little bit of an adult entertainment function. But what they do is they actually advertise and send by SMS messaging all your friends in your contact list and say, hey, go download this. Mm-hmm. So, most people will trust, hey, if I get something from my buddy that says, hey, this is a neat app, go ahead and download it, they're probably going to do it. And so they're actually including some of the distribution mechanism within the malware. And so it's kind of a take on smishing, the old SMS phishing, but it's a little bit of an interesting one because of the adult entertainment aspect as well as the fact that it does it using the contact list after you've already installed the malware.
Yeah, this is
like a technique that was used a while back. Back in the day when the email was just coming about, right? A lot of malware used to go through your contact list and send it out to all of your contacts. So it just sounds like we're seeing a resurgence of that in the mobile world.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what's kind of funny too is that especially like on an Android device or some of these other devices, they actually ask you, can I use the camera? So the malware, it doesn't actually circumvent that aspect of it. It's still going to ask you, but some of the new twists to it are is that it's going to send you to the website instead to submit for a nice adult entertainment for a fee. But it's and nice being facetious, obviously. But it's kind of an old take, or a new take, I should say, on an old attack, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. This brings back memories of magazines. Reading magazines when I was a kid, and in the back there were always those advertisements for those X-ray glasses, and you send in your $9.95, and I'm sure you get some piece of junk back. Obviously, that technology didn't exist then. It doesn't really exist now either, at least not for for a common consumer. But to take this on a little bit of a more serious note, I saw some research recently, and unfortunately I don't have the specifics to cite, but it was a university research activity that was related to looking at some of the subtleties in HD video. And specifically, what they were looking at are some of the things like, the color gradient that we commonly see actually has a lot of detail hidden in HD. And what they were doing is advertising, or amplifying, I should say, the color differences that were taking place. And what you could actually determine from that is you could actually see the pulse of people in these HD videos, which was actually quite interesting. It provided an opportunity, for example, to determine if somebody was lying, because a lot of what polygraphs do is look at changes in pulse rate, changes in perspiration, things like that, and you'll be able to determine those things just by enhancing some of the things in the video. So very tangential to this particular topic, but does kind of hit on the potential for some privacy-type topics associated with it.
Absolutely. And these attacks too, Symantec, pointed this out, that this is really just the shadowing, right, functionality, and a lot of times, but you're right, your concept there, the color gradient, that's a pretty neat little trick if you could do that, consistently, to actually tell if somebody gets excited, as a marketing tool, right? Hey, I got excited, their pulse rate expanded, maybe they're interested in the article.
Right, absolutely. So in the particular study I'd seen, they were using actually, movie set type HD cameras in the demonstration. So I don't know that you could be able to do the same thing with your, typical handheld device. But certainly it's one of the things we would need to be thinking about going forward as we consider, the privacy concerns associated with, video capabilities and things like that. So, thanks for bringing that, John. Sorry for taking it down a little bit of a tangent, but I thought that was sort of an interesting view of this particular story. next story here is we're going to talk a little bit about an article or a paper that was a research paper that was posted. It's called Internet Census 2012, and this is actually posted on a GitHub site. And what we would like to do is take a little bit of a closer look at what's going on with that particular study. In this particular case here, what they did was actually create a botnet to facilitate doing the census. So what they were doing is probing around the Internet and looking for open ports and vulnerable systems associated with that. They did this activity between March and December 2012, and as it turns out, they call it the Carna Botnet, but this is what we had been referring to and reporting on regularly throughout the late spring and the summer last year as the security surveillance camera DVR botnet. So from our perspective and the analysis that we're doing, it was showing up as mostly security surveillance camera DVRs that were being hit by this botnet that is compromised in a sense. But this turned out that it was actually a research study being done by somebody that has not disclosed who they are, and but for good reason. They basically did, in my opinion, violate some laws, that they were actually installing malware on software, we'll say, on devices, and using those devices to facilitate their research. So along the lines here, the paper describes some of the things that they did. They developed a small binary that could be uploaded into these insecure devices. They probed around using common ports, ping, reverse DNS, and that type of thing using those devices. They did some deliberate things to avoid disruption of the devices. That is, they ran the processes at a low priority. They also set it up so that there were no permanent changes. This was, in fact, one of the observations that we made when researching this particular botnet when it was in operation. That is, if you reset the device, that is, powered it down and turned it back on, it would basically void the malware that had been installed. I'm calling it malware just out of habit, but in this particular case, the research software, so to speak. And so reset the device. If you reset the device, that software would no longer be present on the device. In their study, they had, at one time or through the course, 400,000 different devices that were operating their software, and they said that that was only 25% of them protected devices that they had detected. So that's a significant number, up around perhaps 1.6 million devices that they had identified, but they were fairly conservative about which devices they actually installed their software on to make sure that it would fit within the memory that was allocated and wouldn't disrupt the processing on the device. They had, in the paper, they also described some other aspects of the research, that is their data collection strategy, how they did coordination of the scanning, that since they had lots of different devices, they didn't want to be rescanning the same addresses on the same port, so they had a coordination scheme for managing that with the devices without having to upload large lists of addresses for the scanning. They also described a little bit about how they did their command and control. In fact, what they called a CNC-less infrastructure. That is, what they did here is didn't want to have the command and control actually be a bottleneck when you're managing, hundreds of thousands of devices. So they discuss a little bit about that strategy there. And then they also list out, not in specific detail, but sort of conceptually, if you will, the types of devices that they had identified. And they said a lot of them were consumer routers that weren't secured, set-top boxes. They found actually thousands of devices in groups in cases where they'd found set-top boxes that were not secured properly, IPsec routers, BGP routers, x86 equipment with crypto accelerator cards, industrial control systems, even physical door security systems, and even some major router devices. So these are all cases where they found devices using very rudimentary password guessing schemes, that is using basic user account names like root and admin, and either using the account name as the password or checking for no password at all. And it appears to be the extent of the type of weaknesses that they were looking for in the devices. So in their report, they have some interesting information. I'm showing here just a sort of a geographic mapping distribution of where they were finding the most compromised or exposed devices here. And I thought it would be interesting to sort of point out here, I mentioned that this was something we were reporting as a part of ThreatTraq as the security surveillance camera DVR botnet. And the first report that I was able to find that we were talking about this was actually near the end of April. As I mentioned earlier, this group had been operating this botnet between March and December 2012. And you can see here where we picked up activity. It was actually in the third week of March, right around March 18th, where that activity seemed to at least gain some reasonable strength. And what we were picking up here is an attribute of the command and control activities in that botnet. So this is from April 26th. And then going back and looking at the full timeline of the activity associated with that, again, looking at port 210 TCP, we see that activity starting in the about the third week of March and then ending about mid-December in 2012. So although somewhat circumstantial, I have some fairly good confidence that what we were reporting as a security surveillance camera DVR botnet is in fact what these folks were using as the Carna Botnet. And also sort of a supporting information here is that through the period of the summer when we were reporting this on ThreatTraq, what we were reporting was the aggressive scanning activity that this botnet was performing, what we refer to as reconnaissance activity. And apparently what they were doing is trying to identify other vulnerable devices on the Internet that for that purpose of their research activity. So we assume that what they are reporting is, in fact, what they were basically focused on, what their real purpose is, and that was not sort of a cover for some other sort of activity. We don't know specifically who did the report, who did the research, and because they did not disclose that information. But, you know, in my opinion, to some extent here, we've dodged a bullet that is the Internet community in general, and the fact that if somebody had malicious intent, they could use these capabilities for those purposes. That botnet has been basically, those devices reset, that software removed, but the vulnerability still exists.
And you know, Brian, when we were first looking at this botnet, as we were calling it, we did notice that they were and I don't know if we reported this or not, but we did notice that they were dropping a file on the devices that said that this has been accessed or something for research purposes. They left some kind of disclaimer behind on the devices. And, you know, at the time we were thinking, well, this is kind of a ruse or something. Maybe if somebody sees this, they'll just, I don't know. You know, we couldn't even figure out why they would do that. But, you know, all things being said, it is a very, they're very much on the border of legality here, probably stepped over the boundaries of that. You can't just go into somebody's device and put your own software on there without consent. So it's interesting, but I do believe that you're right, that this is the one that we were tracking, and that's just another, you know, nugget in that whole piece of the puzzle that we had seen that message dropped on the devices.
Yeah, you're right there, John. Thank you. So let's take a look at the Internet weather for the last week or so, and there is not what I would describe as a significant difference from what we had reported, actually when we reported on March 14th, a little less than a week ago. Most of the activity that's being reported here is basically a continuation of that activity that we reported then. At the top of the list here is what we see is byte and packet volume on port 53 UDP DNS. Showing 30 days of activity here. It's been a little bit quiet. I think there may be sort of a little bit of a resurgence of activity here today that doesn't show up in the graph from when I took the image. But you can see that there was some, and this is associated with denial of service attack activity that is basically packet floods against multiple different targets, although each one of these spikes generally represents one target or perhaps two or so. And there were events on the 13th of March and the 14th of March, and fairly quiet over the weekend. As I said, it appears that some activity has been picking up today.
You keep using the Q word there, the quiet word, Brian. That's like a temptation.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say things are quiet. These are just no unusual activity outside of the norm here. I'll put it that way. And next one here is, again, we reported on this last week as well. At the time it was underway, this is byte and packet volume activity on source port 161 UDP. It's a simple network management protocol. These are SNMP reflection attacks, that is reflecting packets using a spoofed source address against SNMP servers that are accessible on the Internet, and using that as an amplifying mechanism to perform a denial of service attack against that spoofed source target. And what we had seen is there was, we're showing and described in the last report as well that there was a single target that had somewhat a sustained attack over the course of a couple of days here back on between March 10th and 11th. And then what we had is a variety of targets that were being hit between March 13th and March 15th. And that has since gone quiet since March 15th here. So at the time when we reported this last, that activity was still ongoing. And it has at least slowed, if not stopped for the moment. Next item here is scan sources on port 53 UDP DNS. Again, this was also in last week's report. I'm showing 60 days of data here. And there has been a little bit of a change since we reported last time. That is, what we're seeing is a sort of regular activity. It looks like a sort of a weekly activity of increased number of sources that are scanning on port 53. Most of the sources are from a single provider in China, and the probing activity associated with that is very low and slow, comparatively speaking. So if you look at the number of probes compared to the number of sources here, you don't see that same sort of spiking activity. And there were two things that we observed last time, and it seems to be still consistent, that there's a general upward trend in terms of the number of sources that are doing probing on port 53 UDP. Whether you look at the high marks or the low marks, that increase is still in existence. The one primary difference is since the last time we reported, there's a sort of a drop, if you will, in that activity. Next one here, again, was also reported in the last report. No significant observations here other than we're seeing some spikes on port 6675 TCP. I don't know specifically what they are looking for here. There are several sources, I would say tens of sources, less than 50 that are actually doing this probing activity. The majority of the probes are from a single source in China, and they're using a fixed source port strategy. And this is one of the mechanisms to be able to increase the aggressiveness of the scanning itself, because you don't have to actually set up a full TCP session. And so the large spikes have not continued, but we are still seeing some small spikes all the way up until today, and it seems to be relatively short periods here. So not a significant thing to be concerned about, in my opinion. I, again, really don't know what service is actually used on this port, so it's certainly not one that's well-known or registered. Looking at the top 10 most probed ports, no particular surprises here as well. Most of the ones we've been talking about. I guess the one primary observation is that there are a large number of probes on other ports. So that basically means that a good proportion of the probing activity is on ports that didn't make the top 10 list here. And this is relatively unusual. We don't usually see the other category taking up such a large significance. So I think what I'm going to try to do is take a deeper look at that and get a little bit of idea of what's going on here. Next in line, as usual, is port 445 TCP, port 22 TCP, that is SSH, the secure shell. Port 53 UDP, we talked about that activity a little bit here. Port 3389, that's remote access, and port 1433, database access. Port 8080, and Stan, maybe you have a couple of comments about port 8080 scanning activity.
Well, we've seen actually one particular group doing a lot of port 8080 and port 80 scanning activity together at the same time.
Right.
And that actually, once they do identify hosts on these ports, they look for a specific URL called manager/HTML, and that happens to be the default URL of an Apache Tomcat administrative interface installation. So what these guys seem to be looking for on port 8080 and port 80 is that interface. And we've actually also seen them do some brute forcing of attempting to take passwords and guess what they are so that they can get into the web management interfaces. And once they do that, they have access to a lot more functionality.
Okay.
But the 8080 activity could be related to that.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I didn't mean to put you on the spot there. I know we didn't have a pre-discussion on this particular topic, but I did notice that you were investigating that sort of activity, and as with many of these others, they're looking for applications that they can target and doing, as you said, a brute forcing activity against those password guessing, generally speaking. And then last but not least is port 23 TCP here, which is Telnet, again, that brute force password guessing activity. And we're going to revisit these other ports, the 16464 UDP and 16471 UDP, as we've talked about many times before. That's basically the peer-to-peer communications activity for the zero-access botnet. Looking at the top 10 most sources probing, what we have here is, as usual, port 445 TCP. This is the configure infections, port 23. We see some 11 ICMP activity, and this 2816 actually is 11 ICMP activity as well. So those are probably related in some sense. Now, what I'd like to do is, again, revisit this 16464, 16465 UDP, 16470 UDP, and 16471. And we've said and reported a number of times previously that that's the peer-to-peer activity associated with the zero-access botnet. I guess several weeks ago, looked at the zero-access botnet. We're observing that it is still on an upward trend here. I'm showing 365 days of data here that is in terms of the number of sources that are active on these ports. And there has been an interesting sort of change of events here. That is, right around the middle of February, we saw a sort of an abrupt drop in the number of sources that are using port, in particular, this is, I think, port 16464 UDP, and that has actually continued to decline a little bit here. So there are two possibilities. One is that there might be some type of activity that's taking place that is inhibiting the continuation of this botnet. We see a little bit of a hit also, by the way, on port 16465 UDP as well. Now, the other possibility that exists, and we shouldn't rule out, is that perhaps the zero-access botnet is changing or morphing in some way. It might be changing the way it's doing its command and control, perhaps introducing new ports in the activity or randomizing the ports, something we're not picking up as a part of this analysis activity and the reporting here. So we don't want to rule it out. That's certainly a possibility. And with that, why don't we talk, basically go around the table here and talk about some of our top security concerns. And John, perhaps you can start. What's on your mind this week?
Hi, Brian. I think the biggest thing that's probably on my mind this week is a topic we talk about all the time, which is patching. And patching is probably the least favorite exercise for any sysadmin and any computer owner operator that there can be, because you do that little thing and you never know if it's coming back. Mm-hmm. But from a security perspective, you really, you almost have to jump on that bleeding edge to say, I'm going to put that patch on because typically, whether it's disclosed or not, there's some kind of security aspect to it. Mm-hmm. And we don't think about, as much as we should, all those other devices. We think of our PCs, we think of our servers, we think of our mainframes, mm-hmm. but we don't think about our phones as much as we should. We don't think about our cars. We don't think about our refrigerators. And, it's just more of a, kind of a challenge from that perspective of making sure that we get everything. A good example is iOS 6.1.3 from Apple just came out today. And there'll be some people who'll jump on it real quick and some people who'll be real slow. So I just like that. I always want to just stress is that if you have a device of any kind that runs anything, you make sure that you're on the latest version.
Yeah, very good, John. I think, we probably take some opportunity to emphasize that fact in every one of our programs. And in fact, occasionally we go back and kind of say, well, maybe you want to make sure that the patch is stable before you put it in. And that certainly would apply to systems that have some critical function that absolutely reliability is the most important security attribute. But I think your point is well taken that certainly we want to keep things up to date in patching, and certainly for things that don't have a critical role, we want to be more aggressive with that patching activity.
I was going to say, case in point, not necessarily a mobile device and whatnot, but embedded devices in general. We just had the discussion about all these routers, home routers, security camera DVRs. These are devices that, you don't have antivirus for. You probably don't pay attention to whether they're updated and patched and whatnot. So that's a case right there.
I ran into a situation not too long ago where a multi-purpose copier, had copying fax, was running an operating system, had a bot on it. I mean, it's been a year or so ago, but nobody updated it. If they had updated it, would never had the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right, Stan, your turn.
Well, it's my concern that I have kind of overall. It's not just my weekly concern, and that's the discussion around APT, actually. A lot of people, articles, literature that I read, they kind of focus in on one threat actor or one that's coming from one particular region. Mm-hmm. And it worries me because there's so much attention given to just that, newspaper articles and technical research. But what about all the other potential, malware authors or APT nation-state actors? I don't really hear much about that. And why that worries me is that, sometimes what that could do is that could put you into a tunnel vision. And all you see is this one threat, and you don't concentrate on the others. And that can affect your response activity. It could affect your defense activity. So it's something that's on my mind. I'm always thinking about who else is out there.
Yeah, Stan, I think you're right on with that. One of the I think my general concerns as well has been this notion of getting distracted by the things that are the most noisy. And I think part of what perhaps exists here is that there are certain actors that are relatively noisy compared to others. The ones that tend to be, when I say noisy, more discoverable, not as concerned about hiding their activities, and as a consequence, it draws a lot of attention that direction. There's certainly in the media especially, and there's a good possibility that there are other activities that are less conspicuous and perhaps even being sort of lost in other types of noise and not even really known very well at all. And, certainly a lot of the organized crime groups were getting a lot of attention previously. Zeus Botnet was one that we were paying a lot of attention to, and certainly there are organizations that are still paying attention to that, but I think it's sort of lost the sense of concern, and that as personal, from a personal point of view as opposed to enterprises. In fact, for any organization that's doing financial transactions, those are still significant concerns. There's still a very strong set of organized crime in it, notwithstanding other actors that might be sort of nation-state sponsored that might have activities going on as well. Very good point. So, John, I guess
I'm concern-free.
Busy to be busy?
I'm concern-free. Can't you tell? I've got nothing to worry about.
You've got nothing to worry about.
No, I mean, the reality is I've been so busy on your point of trying to squash some of these noisy actors, so to speak, that I really haven't a lot of time to think about anything else. So it has distracted me from a lot of the other things that need to get done. But otherwise, I am concern-free.
John's been pretty busy with a number of activities here, so we're going to give him a little bit of a pass here. I know he's concerned about a lot of things. He just can't pick out the one that's the most important here. And I'll share mine here. I guess my primary concern recently has been what I will generalize as insecure hosting providers. There seem to be a lot of cases where they're not using very effective security standards. And similar to Stan's concern, there seems to be a little too much focus on the concerns around ISPs, where if you look at the entire internet ecosystem, a good portion of that are those that are actually hosting servers that are exposed to the internet. So, and they're doing that as a professional business, and you would expect them to be following good security practices, but it seems like there are certainly a number of organizations out there that have some pretty poor security practices. And just a few examples of some of the poor security practices that I've observed. One is that there are some poor validation practices associated with who their clients are, who the tenants are on their systems. Sometimes stolen credit cards are able to be used to purchase access to servers, or at the very least, some false identity. That is, there isn't an accountability or traceability back to the sources that are purchasing those systems and using those for malicious purposes. There's a lack of sufficient monitoring on these systems, and in particular what's happening is they're being used in attack activity, and the owners of those systems, the operators of those systems, apparently are unaware that that's taken place, or they would have presumably taken some action. They're unpatched and poorly managed OS images or system images, and as a consequence, they're easily compromised and used in the course of attacks or malicious activities. And they're also doing some things that perhaps out of necessity for scaling, but they're sharing IP addresses among many of their tenants. And a consequence of that is if one IP address is blocked or one of the tenants has a security vulnerability or a problem, they're infected or doing some sort of malicious activity, that IP address might get blocked, and as a consequence, all of the tenants associated with that IP address would be adversely affected. So, and then last but not least, there are some perhaps some insufficient response activity or mechanisms in place. That is, they should be able to, once notified of a particular problem, be able to remediate that problem. And so there are some perhaps some weaknesses there. So I don't know. Do others here have any thoughts on that?
My thought is if the world listened to what you just said, I wouldn't be as busy as I've been.
Well, and you talk too about the guys who are hosting all these servers. I hate to harp on patching again, but you think about it. If you don't patch that server that's hosting 10 different companies or 10 different sites, all of them are susceptible. Everything, and some of those act as proxies, or you connect to this site and it actually passes you to somebody else. Mm-hmm. And so you're compounding the issue if you don't consider in your entire picture of securing your assets that it includes those devices that you're presenting to the public.
Yes. And I think one of the things that's going to be important for people to do is if you're going out to purchase hosting services or cloud services and such, scrutinize who you're going to. Look for some of these things, make sure that they're being handled sufficiently, because it may not be your application that has a problem. It could be somebody else's application that has a problem, but it could mean that there are consequences for your own application or your own hosting or your access to the internet as a consequence of somebody else. And that's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at threattrack@list.att.com. You can also find us on Twitter with the handle @ThreatTraq. The ThreatTraq video is available on the AT&T Tech channel at att.com/ThreatTraq. It's also available on YouTube, and you can subscribe to an audio-only feed at iTunes. And thank you for joining us today. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Thank you, John, Stan, and John for joining us as well. And until then, keep your network safe.